Hello everyone, good evening, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, Curator Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today I am at the heart of Cranbrook Academy of Art, and we are going to be discussing the new studios building designed by the Spanish architect Rafael Moneo. And the new studios opened in 2002. I don't know how old a building has to be to not be considered the new studios building, but here 20 years on or close to it, the new studios are still very much the new studios, and they have no other name other than the Craft Barn, which is not exactly the most popular of the names. Now, just to give you a sense of where we are right in front of Cranbrook Art Museum, which was completed in 1942 by the architect Eliel Saarinen, Cranbrook's principal architect and the first president of the Cranbrook Academy of Art. And when Eliel Saarinen died in 1950, his campus was not completed to the designs that he had prepared. There were multiple projects that Eliel Saarinen had dreamed up, that George Booth had requested, that were never finished. And one of those projects was an Academy dining hall, others were Academy apartments, some were Academy studios. And what's really amazing is that from Eliel Saarinen's death in 1950, until 2002, there were really precious little changes that happened to the Academy of Art. And so the original Saarinen design studios are behind me across the now drained Triton pools, and these were really vastly inadequate studios by the turn of the century. There were, instead of 7 departments, there were 10 departments. There were a lot more students, and they were all using the same Saarinen studios. And it was so bad that students had so little studio space, they would sometimes have to make their work and then cut it down in order to get it out of the building, because the buildings had been so subdivided into different sort of rabbit warrens. In the ceramics department, students would actually make their work in the kiln because the stairway to the kilns was so tiny as to not be able to get the work down into the kiln. I assume once they fired it, it got smaller and they could carry it out. Either way, it was a pretty desperate situation for new space. And so the result of this space issue is Rafael Moneo's new studio building. Now, Moneo is not the first architect to propose new studios for the campus. Robert Saarinen Swanson and George Zonars had created a proposal that would have brought building out in this direction. It was a triangular building, so it would have gone here and then it would have cut back with the natural ravine. Here it's going downhill to the water, so the building would have been a triangular shape with a little plaza where I'm standing. But in 1991, there was a competition that was held, an international architectural invited competition, where 5 architects were asked to create proposals for expanding Saarinen's masterpiece. And it was a pretty precious site, as you can see on your camera. I mean, it is very close to what is one of the great buildings of the 20th century, Cranbrook Academy of Art Library and Museum. And so the intensity of the commission is really, how do you expand from the Saarinen design studios across the pools and attached to the art museum? And so the architects that were invited had to create written proposals, and the winning proposal was written by Rafael Moneo. And I'll talk a little bit about his background as an architect as we move throughout our tour today for today's Live at 5. But I wanted to read for you just one part of the letter that Rafael Moneo sent to the Cranbrook Architectural Advisory Committee. And in this letter, Moneo, who had been in America since the 1970s, but hadn't come to Cranbrook yet, and he gets on campus and he writes this. He says, Cranbrook conveys a sense of unity, and yet there is a surprising variety of styles. It is a continuous change reflecting the chronology of an architectural biography of Saarinen, who, without losing contact with his principals was always sensitive to problems posed by the passage of time. Moneo continues, "The new building would be one more link in the chain. The new building should be autonomous while sharing in the principles which make Cranbrook possible." And so he's really proposing that Cranbrook's architecture is all from one hand, it's all Eliel Saarinen, but there's enormous variety within Eliel Saarinen's buildings, and so this newest building needs to continue that variety. And he's proposing, I'm not going to give you a building that looks like something Saarinen would have done, but I am going to give you a building that looks like it is part of this continuous chain. That was in 1991. Fundraising took forever. They had to raise $18 million, $12 million for this building, $3 million to rehab the older buildings, and then $3 million to endow this building. It took quite a while to actually get the fund raised. It took quite a while to construct it. And then finally, in 2002, this 34,000 square foot building opens. And I am showing you on the screen what's called the knuckle. And this knuckle is the corner that connects Moneo's new studio building to the art museum. And so Moneo is really physically linking the Academy's museum to the Academy studios in a way that previously had not been done. Now, the art museum is part of the Academy. It's meant to be a teaching tool. And so Moneo links together the second floor gallery, which this is the Wenger Gallery, part of Cranbrook Art Museum, and this room is connected into Eliel Saarinen's South Gallery. Then below it in the knuckle is the student gallery, and the student gallery is just one level below, and then it connects back to the student studios. And the new studios were given to the departments which were probably most pressed for space and which have the highest degree of specialized equipment. And so you have on the top floor the fiber department. Think of sort of looms and weaving and sort of yarn-based art, fiber-based art. Then in the middle level you have ceramics and clay and potter's wheel. And then down below you have the metals department. And think of sort of heavy work, and particularly under Gary Griffin, very heavy, big sort of gates and metals. And so they're arranged as if by metaphysical weight, with the lightest arts at the top and the heaviest at the bottom. Now, what's most interesting to me about the knuckle is how it is connected to the art museum, which is that to get into Moneo's new studio building, you use the old art museum doors, which Saarinen designed to bring you into the lower gallery of the art museum. And you'll notice Moneo's building doesn't have a door at all, and so the plaza is the same. He doesn't actually change anything about the landscape, and instead he subsumes the architect's ego, and he allows his building to sort of rely on Eliel Saarinen's door and protect this kind of sacred landscape that Eliel Saarinen had already established. Now, I, of course, left my ID, and so I'm hoping that Kira or someone could let me into the new studios. Now, as we look at this building, Rafael Moneo, he was a Spanish architect. His mother was the daughter of a town magistrate, and his father was an engineer. And Moneo talks about that he didn't know if he wanted to be an architect growing up. He thought he might want to be a philosopher or a painter, but that he comes to architecture late in life. And once he decides to do it, he heads off to the Technical University in Madrid, where he studies in the late 1950s. And in 1961, he moves to Denmark to work for Jarn Utzon, the architect of the Sydney Opera House. And so Moneo is involved in the detailed drawings of the Sydney Opera House. Apparently no one is going to answer my door. And so Moneo is working on the Sydney Opera House drawings, and then he's also traveling around Scandinavia. And so he is visiting with Alvar Aalto, and he is learning more about Scandinavian architecture. Thank you, Kira. And so Moneo returns to Spain in the 1960s, and he sets up his own office in Madrid, where he begins to work on important projects around Spain. And he builds city halls, he builds museums, and by the 1970s, through his writings and through his buildings, he's becoming a very well-respected architect and philosopher. And he's invited to come to America and teach at Harvard and then at Princeton, as well as the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He ends up becoming the chairman of the Department of Design at Harvard, the Graduate School of Design, from 1984 until 1990. And he begins to work on American commissions. And so there are Rafael Moneo buildings at Wellesley, at the MFA Houston, at the Rhode Island School of Design, Columbia, Princeton, as well as the big cathedral out in Los Angeles, and then all of his buildings in Europe, including the Prado in Spain and the Stockholm Museum of Contemporary Art. And as much as he is famous for his architecture, for the buildings, Moneo is also becomes very well known as an architectural critic, philosopher, and teacher. And so I think that early idea that Rafael Moneo wasn't sure if he wanted to be a painter or a philosopher, and he ends up as an architect, it is reflected in the fact that Moneo, at 85 years old today, or this year, is as famous as an architectural critic and writer as he is as a designer. Now, thanks to Kira, we were able to get into the building, and you see here that as we are standing looking through this gallery, we are actually in Eliel Saarinen's lower level of the art museum. And so Moneo has borrowed this space, and he has connected the student gallery with these wonderful wooden doors. And part of Moneo's architecture is that it's always about the context of the site, and it's always about the context of the space. And so Moneo is giving Cranbrook a building that feels at home at Cranbrook because he has thought about what are the materials of Saarinen, what are the material qualities that a modern art school need, but also what does Cranbrook need? And so he does a lot of very clever design ideas, like the fact that Cranbrook Art Museum has a window in every gallery, and so he puts a window in the galleries here. And what's interesting about his windows is that he also then gives us these amazing wooden shutters. And so these are wooden doors that are hinged here, and they will close, and they will entirely seal off the Forum Gallery. And so you can have a gallery with no windows, or you can have a gallery that opens out and looks towards the campus. Now, the knuckle then connects to a 3-story stairway. And for shame, the Art Museum has chosen to block off the view here, which was actually meant for visitors to Cranbrook Art Museum to be able to look out from the Art Museum gallery and look down into the student making. And so as we turn the corner here, we see that the building has an entire wall of glass along its north side. So a few minutes ago, we were looking at the back of the building, which was all brick with small windows. That was getting south-facing light. Here, we are getting all north-facing or even light. And Moneo wanted these to be steel frame windows. The next time you're over at the Brookside Early Childhood Center, you will see how beautiful a steel frame curtain wall is. You will also learn how expensive a steel frame window was. And the Brookside edition was finished in 1996. Then they start building the Institute of Science edition. Then they build the natatorium. They finally get to the academy. And by the time they get here, budgets have gone over for every building. And the steel windows are cut from the new studios. And so we end up with this much less elegant aluminum frame curtain wall. But it does allow us still to look into the building from the outside. It gives the students plenty of natural light. And it also is cool because if you notice, you can actually see the steel beam running behind. And Moneo was interested in building what he called an honest building. He thought Eliel Saarinen's architecture was very honest. It told you how the building was put together, and that was how the building was put together. And so here at the new studios, he shows this great steel beam running across, supporting the cast concrete floor, and then the windows are hung off. It's called a curtain wall system, and the curtain wall is structurally independent from the building, so you can see straight into the building and see the structure. Now, I know from talking to students and artists and residents that you also can hear from one level to the other, so perhaps a slightly thicker building would have prevented that. Now, as we look down, we are seeing some beautiful 1990s Pewabic pottery tiles. As lovely as this is, as gorgeous as this Pewabic pottery wall is, this is a pretty late addition to the building design. Concurrent to the construction of this project, the Kingswood School Green Lobby was being rebuilt. Pewabic Pottery was commissioned to remake all of the tiles for the Kingswood Green Lobby. Pewabic at the time was a nonprofit. It was rather struggling, and they ended up making 6-inch tiles. The problem was that Pewabic made 6-inch construction tiles, which are actually 5 1/4 inches, or they're a variable. They're called 6-inch tiles, but they are not 6 inches. And Cranbrook needed true 6-inch tiles. Eliel Saarinen had designed 6-inch tiles. And so when the Pewabic pottery tiles arrive on Cranbrook's campus, they don't fit. And so this is the correct reproduction of the Kingswood Green Lobby floor, which Cranbrook has paid for but does not fit. Pewabic does not remake the tiles. The tiles that are currently on the floor of the Green Lobby are pretty horrible. Another attempt at reproduction. So these tiles we owned, we had no place for them, and Moneo incorporates them quite beautifully in this light-filled 3-story atrium that leads up to the art museum and down into the metalsmithing department. Now, if you've ever visited the new studios, or if you have ever come on a tour, you might be familiar with the fact that all of the bathrooms, this may be our first Live at 5 bathroom tour, all of the bathrooms are a different primary color, and I just love this little detail. So there's a pink, a yellow, a white, and a green bathroom. And I'm not quite sure why Moneo does it. But it is, I find, just oddly satisfying that each of the bathrooms have this custom color scheme, and that the custom color scheme is in a very Saarinen-esque color way. Now, I asked Iris Eichenberg if we could come through the new studios. We are in the metalsmithing department here. Now, the yellow plastic is not original. That is a COVID precaution. There are 16 studios. Each student gets about 120 square feet to work in. And we can see here Bonnie is busy photographing and making. So this is a real improvement from the old metalsmithing department where the students had just 6 feet of space. Here they have about 12 feet 8 inches up to the ceiling height. These are the windows that we saw from the art museum, from the garden side, from the Triton pool side, and then here's the curtain wall that leads up to the parking lot. Now, the students, if you've never visited us during an open studios, the students also have computer labs here, but they also don't have kitchens in the dormitories. And so the kitchens are all arranged for use by department. And so the center of life at the academy is really all centered in the studio. And so you can't cook, you can't even have a microwave in the dormitory. And so this really is where, if you live on campus, where you are making and sharing most of your meals. And you can see here that the entire department, 8 to 12 people, can fit in this dining room that Moneo designs. And then, of course, it looks up and it has these sort of corner windows looking out into the landscape. Now, at the corner of the building are the studios for the artist in residence. And here's the studio of Iris Eichenberg. And we toured Iris's house quite a while ago on Live at 5, and she said that we could come into her studio today if I apologize for the mess. So this is the model of education at Cranbrook, is one where there are no classes, there are no lectures, there is only the sort of senior artist, the master artist at work alongside his or her students. And so Iris works here in her studio producing art, and then she goes next door and she critiques all of her students who are in their studios. And it really is the cornerstone of the educational model at Cranbrook to use the artist in residence method. And they are here then at the corner of the building. And if we look at the building, you can see the way that it really is a very thin construction. So you see the beams that are holding up the studio of artist in residence Ian McDonald, who's head of ceramics above. And then you can see the steel floor plate that's supporting the concrete poured above. And then Iris has a small library. Now, Moneo apparently does not put light switches where you would think. So I see no light switches, but this is Iris's little library and private office. Now, we will continue on to this happy and sad electrical box. Now, next we are seeing the student crit space. So the way that you learn at Cranbrook is by critique. And so the students bring their artwork into these crit spaces. They do pin-ups, so they pin the artwork on the wall, or place it on the floor or on pedestals, and then they sit with the artist in residence, with their fellow peers, with other artists, visiting artists, and they talk about their work. And that is how we teach at Cranbrook. It's through community discussion. Now, down at the end of the building is the hot shop, and we're going to see in a moment where the hot shop is in relation to the rest of the building. But it is in a corner of the building called the factory. And so the factory houses both the hot shops, but also the kilns on the second floor, and then the dye vats on the third floor. And so these are all of the tools that one needs as a metalsmith. Of course, Cranbrook is still divided by department, or by material. And so these are the metalsmithing workshops. Here we can see the glorious old anvils, which have had a presence here at Cranbrook since 1929, when the first Cranbrook blacksmith shop opened. I don't really know what most of this material is. It all looks like some sort of strange torture device to me, but these are all of the sort of specialist equipment and machines that are used in contemporary metal fabrication. Metal saw. And then what's really nice about the new studios that the other departments don't necessarily have is that they all have some form of outdoor space. So whether that's the third floor fiber patio or the second floor ceramics sort of loading dock area, or the best one, the metalsmithing department has this sunken courtyard. And you have this huge crane that is coming out over the new studios. And so this crane allows Iris or her students to bring artwork from the parking lot level and then down into the courtyard level. Now, I mentioned that this corner of the campus is called the factory. And Moneo really wanted this building to read as different from the rest of the new studios. He talked about how if Saarinen had continued building at Cranbrook, the style would have continued to evolve. And so Moneo wanted to build a building that really doesn't look like any other Cranbrook building as part of his little composition. And so the factory is where all of the hot artwork is being completed. It's where the hot shop is, the kilns. And it also has just a very different architectural composition. It was originally meant to be clad in Rhine zinc, which was a zinc titanium alloy, but again, for budgetary purposes, it ended up being done in lead-coated copper. And Moneo spent a fair amount of time thinking about how he would link together these metal panels and how he would use the folds in the metal to create, to shed water from the building, but also to create a visual aesthetic. And so it's very intentional where windows are punched in. So in the ceramic and where all the glazing and all of the sort of vats of materials are, there's our windows, but then there are no windows where the kilns for the ceramics department are, and then there are outdoor kilns for the ceramics department, all of which lead up to these chimneys that are really quite aesthetically vital to the design of the factory, and then looking up to the third floor to the dye vats of the fiber department. Now, the young architect who was working for Cranbrook on the construction details was Jean-Claude Azar, who is a graduate of the Academy's architecture department and who is still our head of capital projects, so he's still our in-house architect. And Jean-Claude worked with Moneo and Moneo's daughter, who was out of the Moneo's New York office, leading this project to create how exactly all of these panels would be folded together and how the sort of building would be constructed in this honest manner. Now, I think that we will stay outside of the building for a moment, and I just want to give us a sense of where we are in the landscape. So we've just cut across the main new studio space. We were just in the metals department crit space. There's the ceramics department crit space, and then no one is home at the fiber department crit space. And if you came on my brick lecture or the brick walking tour, you know that we talked about these bricks. These are totally non-structural. They are just one brick deep, and they have to have these control joints, which are allowing the bricks to expand and contract on top of the wall of styrofoam and then steel and concrete behind it. So it is not a true stone or brick building in the manner of Ailill Saarinen, but it is modern brick construction. So I think that there are cost limits to the honesty that Moneo could express in his building. But I do think as a formal exercise, this very blocky construction is really actually quite honest to how the bricks are put together. He's not trying to do sort of any dramatic turns of bricks or decorative brick designs. It's really all about the larger mass of buildings, these sort of thick rectangles that are placed in the landscape, and then they are clad in this scrim of bricks, but the bricks are not actually doing the labor of holding anything up. Now, we are going to pop up next into the Cranbrook Academy of Art and Art Museum parking lot, which turns up here, and we are seeing the way that Moneo really wanted his building to reestablish this side of the art museum as an intentional space. And Moneo writes about how the critical axis that linked the ramp of the Chinese dog of the art museum all the way back to Cranbrook House and Gardens. And for the years is that Moneo actually discusses how his building is within the Cranbrook House Gardens, which I think is, it shocked me when I saw that in archives earlier today, because I would think of Cranbrook House Gardens as being much further away. However, at this point in the early 90s, the gardens were more expansive, and they really were maintaining the landscape even further afield. So Moneo really views his building as reestablishing this critical link from the art museum to Cranbrook House, and sort of reclaiming this side of the art museum, which is exquisite, that by building his building, he is reconnecting the academy to this side of campus and to the Cranbrook House Gardens. We are really taking advantage today of daylight savings time as we are beginning to see the effect of the new studios as a lantern in the landscape, and how Moneo uses this wall of all glass to invite us, the visiting public to Cranbrook, to witness the creation of art, the art-making process. And this do in Ailill Saarinen's studios. The studios are higher, the windows are smaller. You can't easily look into Ailill Saarinen studios. However, with the new studios, it becomes a feature, a really critical feature of the design, that we can stand here and see the artist moving around and working from the fiber department upstairs to the ceramics department in the middle. Now, we were just inside the metals hot shop down in the lower level of the factory. But as I mentioned, the ceramic department, the kilns are in the middle level of the factory. And I did not ask the fiber and metals department if I could come visit them today with my camera, so we won't be going back inside the building. But I do just want to highlight again how different architecturally the language of the factory is to the rest of the building. Now, there are two main entrances into the building, one past this beautiful maple tree into the factory, and then the other here, which is slipping through the Saarinen Art Museum. And I think this view of the camera gives us a good sense of how the building relates to the art museum. Moneo spent a fair amount of time in his studio and here on site measuring the building and seeing how could he get essentially 13-foot studios into a 3-story building and always be lower than the lowest part of the art museum. So he did not want his building to come higher than the art museum. He did not want his building to overpower the art museum, and he really didn't want his building to be outside of the human scale. And so he takes advantage of the site and buries the metalsmithing department. But of course, on the other side, as we saw by how I walked out of the courtyard and here, he's taking advantage of the sloping site in order to get a 1/3 of the building sort of invisible to this side. And then one day, in a glorious future where Cranbrook has all the money we ever need, and this building will need to be restored, maybe we can get a steel curtain wall back here, because I think actually the tie-in to Eliel Saarinen's architecture and just the sort of tradition of architectural excellence and truth to materials would really be enhanced if these were not thick aluminum frames, but were in fact gorgeous steel frame windows. So, you know, with a curtain wall system, you can take it down and put something else up. But Moneo is really considering the scale of the building. He's considering the materials of the building, and then the clever sort of slippage of the door into the art museum. And it also gives us this wonderful moment up above where, again, that is the art museum, and this is the intentional overlook where visitors to Cranbrook Art Museum are invited to come and look here at the sort of art making that is happening within the building. Now, when this was happening, it wasn't without controversy because they were putting a building attached to the art museum. It was a pretty bold move. It was a pretty big change to the life of the Academy. But I was impressed by something that Gerhard Nodell told the press when he was asked, you know, are you ruining Cranbrook by putting a new the Cranbrook campus? And Gerhard said, if George Booth were alive, the Academy would be physically changing by reshaping the Academy. And Gerhard continues, by reshaping the Academy, we are reshaping and altering our expectations of the Academy. And so the buildings really are a physical change, but they were a necessary change in order to keep the strength of the Academy going and in order to enhance the department and the work of the Academy. Yes, Cranbrook's architecture from Saarinen was beautiful and singular and functional and had worked for 70 years, but it just wasn't big enough and it wasn't modern. And so this change, this physical change to the Academy results in really intense changes in the work of the students and what they can do. And I was impressed by the head of ceramics in that same article who was interviewed about all of the new kilns that would be available to use. And this idea that with these new kilns, the ceramics department would finally be operating sort of efficient kilns, modern kiln production, rolling floor kilns where you can set the art up and move it in, computer-controlled kilns, so that instead of, they described it as sticking a stick in the cake batter and seeing if it was done, now you could actually look at the computer monitor and see if your kiln was done. You could control how it heated up and how it cooled down. And it was interesting that the comparison was made that basically Cranbrook was using kilns of the ancient times, and we were moving into the kilns of industry, and that in industry, being 90% more efficient than what Cranbrook was currently using just made business sense, but that in the art sense, art and industry are so far apart that those concerns of efficiency are computer controlled didn't tend to get naturally into the art world. And yet with the construction of this new building, we were modernizing, we were making more efficient the actual methods of art production. Now, thanks so much for joining us on this tour of the new studios. Perhaps on another day, we will tour a building that appears about a decade after the new studios. This one is the Cranbrook Collections Wing, also known as the Vault of the Museum and Cultural Properties Collection. And that was designed by Smith Group, architecturally significantly less interesting building, but quite large. And now, how the new studios building connects to Cranbrook Art Museum. And here we have Eliel Saarinen's 1942 masterpiece, the Art Museum and Art Library Peristyle, and the way that you can take these stairs down along the axis established by George and Ellen Booth, and then you come past this really stunning glowing lantern of the new studios building, a building that expresses with a new architectural language, I think, the same architectural goals of Eliel Saarinen, of permanence, of beauty, of sort of specialness of place, a sense that the building was handmade for a very specific purpose. And Moneo really gets it. I think he understood the campus intuitively on his first visit, and I think he understood really how to build a building, even at an enormous cost-saving measures, how to create a building that stands up to Eliel Saarinen's architectural genius for a new century. And the cost-cutting measures really were severe, to the extent that Lillian Bowder calls Rafael Moneo's daughter in the New York office and says, "If we cut 6 feet out of this building, how much money will I save?" She gets her answer, and this becomes 6 feet shorter. So there are a lot of changes that had to be made, and yet in the end, we ended up owning and working and living in a pretty remarkable campus addition to this special campus. Now, one other little comment that Rafael Moneo wrote about the Cranbrook campus is that he said on his first visit to the campus, he was astounded by the presential goal. It's not often an architectural goal, let alone something that an architect could achieve. And he said that the presence of beauty and the ability of beauty to change lives was what Eliel Saarinen had achieved and what he would work towards if given the chance to build at Cranbrook. I do think that is what he achieved, and I invite everyone to come to Cranbrook and to explore. If you want to explore the new studios in person, there is just one chance a year to visit the Academy Studios, and that is during the Cranbrook Open Studio event or the studio fundraiser. So look out on your calendar next May. There will be the opportunity to come and tour these buildings. In the meantime, if you are here on campus on Saturday, the ceramics department will be hosting the annual cup sale, and that will be taking place at the Art Museum, not in the new studios this year, but it will be the sale of cups made here in the ceramics department for $30 each to raise funds for the ceramics department. Now, the cups will sell fast and they will be brutal, so bring your boxing gloves as well as eye protection, and then get here right at noon and find the best cups. Not really, but do get here at noon if you want the best cups. It will be a crazy and exciting time to support the students and to visit Cranbrook here at peak foliage. So thanks so much for joining me as we took a dive into the new studios building built by Rafael Moneo and his daughter in 2002, in addition to the studios that Eliel Saarinen gave us from the 1920s to the 1940s, and the current home of the Cranbrook Academy of Art departments of fiber, ceramics, and metalsmithing. I'll be back next Wednesday for another Live at 5. Kevin Adkisson with the Center for Collections and Research.